Origins of Hungary, from prehistoric settlers to the Bronze Age. In the heart of Europe lies a basin that has for millennia acted like a great amphitheater of civilizations, the Carpathian Basin. Encircled by mountains, watered by rivers, and open at its edges to the currents of migration, this land became both a refuge and a battlefield. Here, long before the idea of Hungary existed, human hands left their earliest marks. The first known inhabitants appeared during the Paleolithic era, between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago. These early people were Neanderthals, whose flint tools and bones are still uncovered in places like Erode. They roamed as far as the Gerex Mountains, hunting cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, and herds of wild horses. Imagine their fires flickering inside caves, the smell of charred meat heavy in the air, while just beyond the glow lurked predators and the icy winds of the glacial age. Life was brutal, but it was here that human endurance took root, laying a foundation for all that would follow. By the Neolithic period around 6000 BC, the basin had transformed into a cradle of farming life. The Starchevo-Kuros culture spread across the region, followed by the linear pottery culture, named for the simple incised lines on their clay vessels. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, raised livestock, and shaped the land with quiet persistence. Their pottery, humble cups, goblets, and jugs may seem plain, yet they reflect something profound. A people no longer living day to day, but shaping objects for permanence, ritual, and memory. These early farmers brought with them a new rhythm of life: seed, harvest, and store. For the first time, the Carpathian Basin pulsed with the cycles of agriculture rather than the chaos of the hunt. As the centuries passed, the Bronze Age dawned. Around 2500 BC, this was an age of transformation, where metallurgy redefined power. The Pannonian Basin emerged as a vital hub of bronze casting. Among its cultures, the Ottomani people stood out. Their settlements, fortified with moats, walls, and towers, were not mere villages but proto-cities, evidence of a society both prosperous and perpetually on guard. War and wealth went hand in hand. Within these fortresses, artisans crafted bronze jewelry of spirals and coils, weapons of gleaming copper-tin alloy, and finely made ceramics that carried their designs across trade routes, stretching beyond the basin. To walk into one of their settlements would be to hear the clang of hammers striking bronze, the chatter of merchants from distant lands, and the cautious silence of guards stationed on walls. Life here was defined by vigilance. Each rampart a reminder that prosperity had to be defended against the ever-moving tides of tribes pressing in from the east and west. Yet behind the weapons and walls, there was also imagination. Archaeologists have uncovered ritual sites suggesting the Ottomani and their neighbors believed deeply in a world beyond this one. Burial mounds often contained ornaments, tools, and even food, prepared carefully for the afterlife. This was not a people who lived only for survival. They looked to eternity. The Carpathian Basin, by this point, was not just land, it was a crossroads. Traders carried amber from the Baltic, salt from Transylvania, and bronze from workshops deep in the basin. Every item that passed hands told a story of exchange, encounter, and conflict. What would later become Hungary was already absorbing and reshaping influences, long before the Magyars wrote into history. It is in this age that one sees the outline of something permanent, a land destined never to be isolated, but always entangled in the wider struggles of Europe. Where walls rose, they were besieged. Where trade flourished, it drew enemies. And where cultures thrived, they inevitably merged with newcomers. The soil itself, rich and black, seemed to call both farmer and warrior. These were Hungary's first beginnings, not yet a nation, not yet even a people who would call themselves one, but a stage set for centuries of arrival, conquest, and reinvention. And in this vast stage, the curtain was only beginning to rise. The Iron Age, and the arrival of new peoples. As the Bronze Age dimmed, the Iron Age cast its darker shadow over the Carpathian Basin. Around the 9th to 8th centuries BC, new tribes arrived, carrying with them not only sharper tools and weapons, but also a reshaping of life itself. The first among them were Iranian-speaking groups, warrior peoples, who buried their dead with weapons and goods meant for the afterlife. Graves reveal swords, spears, and ornaments lying beside the bones of nobles. These objects speak of a culture in which war was not just a necessity, but an identity, a passage carried from life into death. Soon after, in the 5th century BC, Illyrian tribes entered Transdanubia, carving their presence into the southern reaches of the basin. They were soon joined by the Celts, a people whose restlessness brought them across much of Europe. The Celts left behind more than traces. They introduced iron working on a scale unseen before, perfected metal casting, and minted the first coins ever struck in this land. For the first time, value could be measured not only in cattle or bronze, but in stamped metal bearing symbols of power. It was a revolution, as much economic as cultural. Archaeological finds reveal the sophistication of Celtic craftsmanship. Torques of twisted gold, intricate weaponry, pottery adorned with swirling motifs that seem to mimic the natural flow of rivers and wind. In their artistry, we glimpse a worldview in motion, restless as the people themselves. Their arrival was not merely an invasion, but a transformation, adding layers to the ever-growing mosaic of the Carpathian Basin. It was during this same period, in the 1st millennium BC, that the ancestors of the Hungarians began to emerge in history. Linguistic studies trace the Hungarian tongue back to the Ugric branch of the Uralic languages, alongside Khanty and Mansi, distant cousins living far to the east in Siberia. From that linguistic root, scholars can hear faint echoes of migration. Words tied to fishing and hunting, words for horses and metal, words borrowed from Iranian nomads. They tell the story of a people who wandered, adapting to each culture they encountered, yet retaining a voice distinct enough to carry through millennia. For centuries, scholars debated who the Hungarians truly were. Medieval chroniclers, eager to craft noble origins, declared them descendants of the Huns' fierce heirs of Attila. Others saw them as Scythians, the legendary horse archers of the steppe. These were stories of prestige, woven from fragments of memory and myth. But by the 18th century, the truth became clearer. The Hungarian language was undeniably Uralic, kin to peoples of the forests and rivers of the north. Their roots were not born of empire, but of endurance from the Siberian wilderness. Still, the precise birthplace of the Proto-Hungarians remains a subject of debate. The prevailing theory places them in western Siberia, along the Irtysh, Ob, and Tobol rivers. From there, driven by climate shifts, by the need for pasture, and by the pressure of rival tribes, they began to drift westward. Step by step, they crossed into the Ural region, where their lives intertwined with Iranian-speaking Scythians and Sarmatians. Through these contacts, they learned the secrets of mounted warfare, ironworking, and the culture of the horse, a partnership that would define their destiny. One of the most evocative glimpses into these ancient wanderings comes not from archaeology, but from a medieval monk. In the 1230s, Brother Julian of the Dominican order set out from Hungary in search of his people's lost homeland. He traveled east to the Volga, and there, in the lands of the Volga Bulgars, he discovered a group who still spoke Hungarian. Imagine his astonishment, hearing familiar words spoken thousands of miles from home. To him, it confirmed the legends of Greater Hungary, a homeland abandoned but not forgotten. To us, it is a haunting reminder that the Magyar story was one of dispersal and survival long before it was one of conquest. Their migrations were not mere wanderings. They were forced by hunger, by drought, by enemies pressing from the Altai and Samoyedic north. Each displacement brought new skills and new scars. They learned to fight like the Scythians, to craft metal with new precision, and to breed horses fit for war. The Proto-Hungarians became a people, forged in movement, shaped not by static homelands, but by the ceaseless winds of the steppe. And so, by the time they turned their eyes westward toward the fertile plains of the Carpathian Basin, they were already a people of paradox, heirs to Siberian forests and steppe traditions, shaped by the fires of countless cultures, yet still carrying with them a language and identity uniquely their own. The stage was set for their next encounters. Beyond the Carpathians, the Roman Empire would rise, and with it a new kind of order, one that could absorb, resist, and eventually crumble under the weight of peoples like the Magyars, who moved restlessly at its edges. Rome, Huns, and the collapse of empires. By the closing years of the 1st century BC, the Carpathian Basin had drawn the attention of a power unlike any before, Rome. Emperor Augustus extended Roman control into the lands between the Drava and Sava rivers, pressing northward to the Danube. Under Claudius, these territories were organized into the province of Pannonia. It was more than conquest, it was a redrawing of the map, the incorporation of this restless land into the machinery of empire. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman civilization reshaped the basin. Roads cut through forests and plains, stone bridges spanned rivers, and towns grew where once there had been only tribal camps. Aquincum, today part of Budapest, became a thriving military and commercial hub. Sopianae, Modenpex, Arabona, Győr, and Solva, Esztergom, flourished, each an outpost of Roman order. Within their walls, mosaics glistened, amphitheaters roared with spectacle, and markets buzzed with trade. Over time, the local peoples were drawn into Roman life, adopting Latin customs, Roman dress, and the Christian faith that gradually spread across the province. Yet Pannonia was not merely a province, it was a frontier. The Danube formed a living border, an unquiet edge where the empire met the chaos of migrating tribes. To the Romans, Pannonia was both shield and sword, protecting Italy from the restless peoples beyond. But such borders are fragile. By the 5th century AD, the frontier cracked beneath the thunder of hooves. The Huns, nomads from the steppe, swept into the Carpathian Basin. In 433, Roman general Aetius ceded Pannonia to Rugila, their ruler. Within 2 years, Rugila's nephews Attila and Bleda compelled the Eastern Roman Empire to sign the Treaty of Margus, acknowledging Hunnic dominance. The balance of power had shifted. Rome, once the master, now yielded to the steppe. Attila's reign was brief but apocalyptic. Chronicles describe his warriors as demons of the plain, their arrows blotting out the sun, their charges breaking even Rome's legions. He ruled from his camp along the great Hungarian plain, yet his reach extended deep into Europe. Cities burned, emperors trembled, and for a moment it seemed the world itself bent to the will of the Huns. But empires built on terror are fragile. When Attila died in 453, perhaps from a burst blood vessel on his wedding night, the vast Hunnic confederation began to fracture. A year later, at the Battle of Nidau, the Gepid king Ardaric led a coalition of Germanic tribes against the Huns. Attila's son Elac fell in battle, and with him fell the dream of a Hunnic empire in Europe. What followed was not peace, but chaos. The Ostrogoths, Gepids, Lombards, and Slavs surged into the vacuum, each seizing a portion of the land. For generations, the basin was a shifting chessboard of tribes and warlords, kingdoms rising and falling as quickly as they were named. The Romans were gone, their cities fading into ruin, their mosaics buried beneath ash and soil. The Huns had vanished into legend, remembered in fear and in myth, but no longer present on the field. And yet, the memory of Attila lingered. In the Middle Ages, Hungarian chroniclers like János Thurócsi sought to claim descent from the Huns, weaving a lineage that tied the Magyars to the scourge of God himself. It was a claim of nobility, of ferocity, of rightful dominion. Though modern scholarship dismisses this direct connection, the idea endured, shaping Hungarian identity for centuries. To stand in the Carpathian Basin in those years after Attila's fall would have been to see a land without masters. Camps rose and fell with the seasons. Fields were abandoned and resettled. Languages mingled, belief systems overlapped, and alliances shifted like sand. The soil was rich, the rivers plentiful, but no one power could hold it for long. It was in this crucible of instability, where Rome's order had collapsed and the Huns' terror had dissolved, that the next chapter of Hungarian history would unfold. A new nomadic power, forged in distant lands and tempered by ceaseless migration, was already on the horizon. They would come not as raiders alone, but as founders, carrying with them oaths of loyalty and the promise of a homeland. Stop. The Avars and the dawn of the Magyars. In the century after the Huns vanished from Europe's stage, the Carpathian Basin became a prize fought over by tribe after tribe. But by the late 6th century, a new force swept in to claim it: the Avars. Turkic-speaking nomads from the east, they appeared suddenly, their mounted warriors and swift campaigns reminiscent of the Huns of old. By 567, allied with the Lombards, they struck down the Gepids and seized control of Pannonia. When the Lombards soon marched south into Italy, the basin was left entirely in Avar hands. For over 2 centuries, the Avar Khaganate ruled this land. They built fortified camps, controlled vital trade routes, and extracted tribute from neighboring peoples. Archaeological discoveries reveal glittering belt buckles, golden horse ornaments, and elaborate weaponry, evidence of an elite steeped in wealth and steppe traditions. The Avar elite led a nomadic existence, roaming with their herds, while the subjugated populations, largely Slavs, tilled the soil, crafted pottery, and even fought as auxiliaries in Avar armies. It was a system both powerful and precarious. The Khagans presided over a confederation that bound together different tribes by force, tribute, and fear. Yet within, tensions simmered. Uprisings broke out. Local tribes tested the limits of Avar control, and foreign powers pressed at the edges. The Franks, under Charlemagne, struck hard in the late 8th century, shattering Avar fortresses and plundering their wealth. By the dawn of the 9th century, the Khaganate was a shadow of its former self, its story fading into obscurity. But just as the Avars declined, another people were on the move: the Magyars. Their path toward the Carpathian Basin had begun far to the east, in Livadia, near the Khazar Khaganate. Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, writing in the 10th century, described Livadia as a land named after the Magyar leader Levedi, who ruled there as a Khazar vassal. Yet even here, life was precarious. The relentless pressure of Pecheneg raids forced the Magyars to abandon Livadia. Some crossed south beyond the Caucasus, but most migrated to the steppes north of the Black Sea. Etelköz became the crucible of Magyar identity. Here, under the leadership of Almos, the tribes consolidated into a confederation. Their story is preserved in one of the most haunting episodes of Hungarian tradition: the Blood Oath. As the chronicler Anonymous recounts, 7 Magyar chieftains gathered and swore eternal loyalty to Almos. They mixed their blood in a shared vessel, sealing a covenant of unity and destiny. In this moment, the scattered clans bound themselves into a single people, guided by Almos and his line, the Arpad dynasty. The symbolism of the oath cannot be overstated. Among steppe peoples, blood was more than life. It was essence, lineage, unbreakable promise. By swearing in blood, the Magyars declared that betrayal would mean death, and loyalty would mean immortality through their people's survival. It was a ritual both sacred and political, echoing the traditions of other nomadic confederations while marking the Magyars as something distinct. Yet destiny would not fall to Almos alone. While he is remembered as the founder, it was his son Arpad who emerged as the true hero of Magyar history. It was Arpad who would lead them westward, across the Carpathians, into the basin that had seen Rome, Huns, and Avars rise and fall. But before that crossing, the Magyars would be drawn into the web of European politics, wielded as mercenaries, feared as raiders, and finally compelled to seek a permanent homeland. The stage was set. The Avars had left behind their ruins. The basin lay open once more. And from the east, hardened by migration, oath, and war, the Magyars advanced unaware that their next decision would bind them forever to the land that would one day bear their name. Conquest of the homeland and the age of raids. The Magyars entered history as shadows on horseback, mercenaries in the service of empires greater than themselves. By the late 9th century, they had settled in the steppes of Etelkos, between the Dniester and the Dnipro rivers. From there, Byzantine diplomacy reached out to them. In 894, unwilling to wage direct war against the First Bulgarian Empire, the Byzantines sought Magyar swords instead. It was a fateful alliance. Arpad, son of Almos, led the campaign. His horsemen swept into northeastern Bulgaria, burning villages, scattering defenders, and reminding Europe why nomadic cavalry inspired terror. But alliances are fickle. Simeon I of Bulgaria retaliated, drawing the Pechenegs into his service. The Magyars suddenly found themselves caught between enemies, an anvil and hammer closing in from both sides. Defeat was crushing, and with it came the recognition that Etelkos could no longer be home. So Arpad made the decision that would define his people's history. He led them across the Carpathians, into the Pannonian Basin. It was not a simple migration. It was conquest. The Illustrated Chronicle speaks of a dual leadership system. Almos as the sacred leader bound to the old lands, Arpad as the war chief who must guide the tribes westward. Almos never crossed the mountains. Some say he died by suicide. Others whisper of ritual sacrifice, an offering so that his son's people might be free. By 895, the Magyars had established themselves in Pannonia, founding what would become the Principality of Hungary. Power was divided between Arpad and Kurshan, each holding a role within their confederation, though history remembers Arpad as the true architect of conquest. Kurzan expanded Magyar influence through alliances with East Frankish King Arnulf, who promised spoils from Moravian lands in exchange for Magyar raids. But treachery ended Kurshan's story in 904, when he was assassinated during negotiations with the Franks. After that, Arpad stood alone as leader. The Magyars, however, were not content with settlement. They turned their skill in war into opportunity. Europe became their battlefield. The Italian campaign of 899 marked one of their most audacious raids. Crossing into northern Italy, they devastated the countryside and advanced to Pavia, the royal capital. King Berengar I hastily assembled an army of 15,000 men, 3 times the Magyar force. Confident in his numbers, he refused terms of safe withdrawal. But Arpad's horsemen thrived on deception. Feigning retreat, they lured the Italians into complacency near the Brenta River. Berengar's troops, unprepared, lounged inside their camp, eating and drinking, when 3 Magyar units forded the shallow waters undetected. Arrows rained down, and in the chaos, the Magyars struck from multiple flanks. The Italian army collapsed within hours. Berengar barely escaped, disguised as a common soldier. The raid ended not only in plunder, but in legend proof that the Magyars were masters of psychological as well as military warfare. From there, raids became a rhythm of Magyar life. In the early 10th century, they launched campaigns deep into Saxony, Swabia, Lotharingia, and Lombardy. They returned with spoils of gold, silver, slaves, and weapons. To Europe, they were marauders, a scourge like the Vikings who struck from the sea, except these raiders came with thunder on land. To the Magyars, the raids were more than plunder. They were diplomacy by force, a declaration of presence, a way to force kings and emperors to acknowledge their power. The victories were staggering. In 907, at the Battle of Pressburg, they crushed the Bavarian army, securing the basin against Germanic incursions. In 908, they triumphed at Eisenach, killing Duke Burchard of Thuringia and Bishop Rudolf of Würzburg. In 910, they defeated the Frankish imperial army itself at Lechfeld, luring their foes into another trap and sending them fleeing in disgrace. For a time, it seemed nothing could withstand the Magyar way of war. Picture the terror of those years, church bells tolling in warning, villagers fleeing into forests, kings summoning armies already dreading ambush. Chroniclers in monasteries wrote of Magyar raids with trembling pens, convinced they were divine punishment. To face them was to face the unknown. A people who seemed to vanish into the plains and strike again before dawn. But time and fortune would not always favor them. Though Arpad's sons and successors carried the raids further and deeper into Europe, the seeds of their decline were already being sown. In the heart of the continent, enemies were learning to adapt, to face steppe cavalry not with panic but with steel. The days of easy victory were numbered. Still, in those first decades after their conquest of the homeland, the Magyars carved their reputation into Europe's memory. They were no longer wanderers from Siberia, no longer vassals of Khazars, no longer mercenaries in the service of Byzantium. They were conquerors in their own right, lords of Pannonia, feared from the Alps to the Rhine, from the Po to the Seine. Defeat, transformation, and the birth of Christian Hungary. For decades, the Magyars seemed unstoppable, their raids slicing across Europe with terrifying precision. But no tide of conquest lasts forever. In 955, near the German city of Augsburg, their fortune broke against the shield wall of Otto I, King of Germany. It was the Second Battle of Lechfeld, a clash that would end an era. The Magyars, led by Bulksu, Lehel, and Sur, had already routed Bohemian forces and expected yet another easy victory. But Otto's army was prepared. Heavily armed knights, disciplined formations, and the advantage of weather turned the battle against the horse archers of the steppe. For the first time in living memory, Magyar arrows failed to scatter the enemy. Forced into brutal hand-to-hand combat, their light cavalry found itself at a fatal disadvantage. By the battle's end, the Magyar army was destroyed. Their leaders were captured and executed in Augsburg, a public spectacle meant to send a message. The age of Magyar raids was over. To Europe, it was deliverance. To the Magyars, it was revelation. The strategy of endless plunder and raiding had reached its limit. What followed was not collapse, but transformation. The Magyars, hemmed in by defeat, turned their gaze inward. The endless pastures of the steppe were behind them. The fertile fields of the Carpathian Basin became their future. They settled, built villages, and turned to agriculture. In this soil, they blended with Slavs, remnants of Avars, and other peoples, forging a more rooted society. Yet, unity was fragile. The old tribal structure, with its chieftains clinging to autonomy, threatened to fracture the new homeland. It was Grand Prince Géza Rare, 972-997, who forced a change. Ruthless, pragmatic, he crushed rivals and centralized authority in his own hands. Later, his son Istvan would remember him grimly. My father's hands were covered in blood, but blood was the price of survival. Without a strong center, Hungary might have fractured like the Avars, swallowed by neighbors stronger than themselves. Géza understood that strength was not only won with the sword, but also with alliances. He looked west, toward the Holy Roman Empire and made a bold choice: conversion to Christianity. In 973, he and his household were baptized, though he is said to have remained pagan at heart. His conversion was political more than spiritual, an act to secure recognition, legitimacy, and peace with the great powers of Europe. He built the first churches, allowed missionaries to spread their faith, and began weaving Christianity into the fabric of Magyar life. Marriage sealed the strategy. His son, István, wed Gisela of Bavaria, sister of Duke Henry IV. It was more than a union. It was a bridge linking the Magyars to Europe's Christian elite. Through Gisela, István inherited legitimacy in the eyes of Western rulers, strengthening his claim as Géza's successor. Under Géza, Hungary stepped back from endless raids and began to imagine permanence. Under István, soon to be canonized as Saint Stephen, that vision would become reality. He built a kingdom recognized by the Pope, crowned with legitimacy not by conquest but by Christian kingship. The nomadic riders of the East had become settled rulers of the West. This transformation was profound. Within a century, the Magyars had gone from feared raiders to respected members of the European order. Their language remained Uralic, distinct from their neighbors, yet their faith, institutions, and dynastic marriages bound them to Christendom. They had preserved their identity while embracing a new role, not as outsiders, but as shapers of medieval Europe. To trace Hungary's path from the Paleolithic hunters of Erd, through the bronze casters of Ottomani, the horsemen of Etelkos, the raiders of Pannonia, and finally the Christian princes of the Carpathian Basin, is to see history itself at work, a story of adaptation, survival, and reinvention. Each age left ruins and memories, but each also built a foundation for what followed. By the time István took the crown, Hungary was no longer a fleeting confederation of tribes, but a kingdom rooted, recognized, and ready to endure. The land that had once been crossroads and battlefield had become a nation. And from it, a people emerged who would carry both the scars of their wandering past and the promise of their new European destiny.